The last thing the woman gave the little girl was a single, worthless coin. She pressed it into the girl's palm, her fingers like sharp little bones. "You wait right here," the woman commanded, her voice a splinter of ice. "I have to see a man about our ticket. Don't you move a muscle." Then she was gone, melted into the steam and the noise of the Grand Union Depot, a ghost in a gray dress. The girl's name was Hannah. She was 8 years old, and she was good at waiting. She waited as the sun bled out of the sky and the gas lamps hissed to life, painting the huge, cavernous station in shades of orange and black. She waited as the shouting conductors and the crying babies and the rumbling baggage carts all faded away, one by one. The last train shrieked into the night, and then there was only silence. Hannah sat on the hard wooden bench, a tiny island in a sea of emptiness. She hadn't moved a muscle, but she knew. She knew with the cold, heavy certainty that only a child who has been hurt too many times can feel. Her stepmother, Martha, was not coming back. The coin in her hand wasn't for a ticket. It was the price of being thrown away. In her pocket, her other hand was wrapped tight around her only real treasure, a small wooden bird carved from a single block of pine, its wings half spread like it was about to take flight. Her father had made it for her, his big, rough hands so surprisingly gentle. It was all she had left of him. Now, it was all she had left of anyone. The station grew cold. The shadows danced like long, twisted monsters on the walls. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. But what Hannah didn't know was that she wasn't the only one in that station with ghosts. Someone else was there, a man wrapped in his own kind of silence, and he was watching her. Arthur Vance hated towns. He hated the noise, the stink, the crush of people. They were a necessary evil, a place to get supplies for the sprawling, empty kingdom he called a ranch. His life was a fortress built of hard work and silence, designed to keep the past where it belonged. Buried. He'd come to the depot to pick up a new harness, a simple errand. But the train was late, and his patience was worn down to a nub. He was a tall man, built like an oak tree, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same rugged cliffs that bordered his land. His eyes were a pale, flat gray, and they missed nothing. The people in Ogden knew him as the rich rancher, the man with more land than God and a heart made of stone. They weren't wrong. He finished his business and was turning to leave, eager for the long, quiet ride home. That's when he saw her. Just a little slip of a thing, perched on a bench, her feet not even touching the floor. Her dress was worn, her shoulders tight with a tension no child should carry. She was staring straight ahead into the growing darkness, perfectly still. He frowned, a child left behind. It was a messy detail in a world he fought to keep orderly, not his problem, not his concern. He took 2 steps toward the exit. His boots echoed in the empty hall. Each step was a decision. Leave. Go home. It's not your business. But he stopped. His whole life, his whole ranch, his whole fortress of silence was built around an empty space, a hole carved out of his heart 10 years ago when he'd lost his wife, Eleanor, and the son he'd never gotten to know. The silence in his massive house wasn't peace. It was the sound of everything that wasn't there. And in the stillness of that little girl, he recognized the same kind of quiet. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of loss. The quiet of being left behind. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of a decade, he turned back around. This was a mistake. He knew it was a mistake, but he was walking back toward the girl anyway. He approached the bench like he was approaching a spooked colt. Slow. Careful. He wasn't a man who knew how to be gentle, especially with children. They were a foreign language he'd never learned. He stopped a few feet away, his long shadow falling over her. "You're out late," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. It was a voice made for shouting at cattle, not talking to a little girl. Hannah flinched, but didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on some invisible point in the gloom. "I'm waiting," she whispered, her voice so small he could barely hear it. "Waiting for who?" He pressed. The question was blunt, not kind. "My stepmother. She told me to wait here." Arthur scanned the empty station. The station master, a harried man named Peters, was already turning down the lamps, getting ready to lock up. The last train was a fading memory in the night. "Seems to me she's forgotten you," he stated plainly. There was no sugar on the words. That's what made her finally look at him. Her eyes were huge in her small, pale face, and they were the color of moss, deep and green and filled with a gravity that was terrifying in a child. There were no tears, just a cold, hard acceptance that made his gut twist. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, and in that look, he saw it all. The woman wasn't coming back. This was real. A hot wave of irritation washed over him. He was a rancher. He dealt with cattle and land, not lost children. This was a problem for the sheriff. He grunted and strode over to the station master. "There's a child here," Arthur said, jerking his thumb toward the bench. "Been left." Peters sighed, wiping his brow with a greasy rag. "Saw her myself. Figured her people were just in the privy. Happens." He looked over at Hannah, then back at Arthur, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Well, I'll have to take her down to Sheriff Callahan. Not that he'll know what to do with her till morning." Just then, a cold wind howled, rattling the station doors. Rain began to spatter against the glass. A big storm was rolling in off the mountains. Arthur thought of the long, dark ride home. Then he thought of this little girl, this scrap of a thing, being locked in a cold, lonely jail cell for the night. The thought was like a burr under his saddle. Sharp, uncomfortable. "The sheriff's office is no place for a child," Arthur heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they did Peters. The station master just shrugged. "Got no orphanage here, Mr. Vance, and nobody's looking to take in a stranger's kid on a night like this." He paused, and a sly, calculating look came into his eyes. He was sizing Arthur up. The big house, the reputation, the money. "Your place is big enough. You got that housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, just for the night, till the sheriff can sort it out in the morning." Every instinct in Arthur's body screamed no. His house was not a home. It was a tomb, a quiet, orderly monument to his grief. Bringing a child into that silence felt like sacrilege. It was a violation of the rules he'd lived by for 10 years. But then he looked back at Hannah, still on that bench, a perfect picture of absolute desolation. And the memory hit him like a physical blow. Another small body, impossibly still, wrapped in a blanket. The memory stole his breath, cracked open the fortress he'd built around his heart. Against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation, he heard himself agree. "Fine," he bit out, the word tasting like poison. "For the night. Have the sheriff come out to my place tomorrow, first thing." He walked back to the bench, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Come on," he said to Hannah. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. Hannah looked up at the giant, grim-faced man towering over her. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. But what choice did she have? Her stepmother was gone. The station was empty and dark. This man, as terrifying as he was her only way out. She slid off the bench. Her small hand was deep in her pocket, fingers wrapped tight around the smooth wooden bird. Without a single word, she followed him out into the rain and the raging wind. The ride to the Vance expanse was a journey into darkness. The world outside the wagon was a blur of whipping trees and driving rain. The only sounds were the plodding of the horses' hooves, the groan of the wagon wheels, and the howl of the storm. Hannah huddled under a thick wool blanket Arthur had tossed over her. It smelled of horse and leather, and the wild, clean scent of the rain. She risked a glance at the man beside her. His face was a mask, his profile sharp against the occasional flash of lightning. He held the reins with a steady, capable grip, his eyes fixed on the muddy track ahead. He never once looked at her. It was like he was hauling a sack of grain, not a living, breathing child. When they finally arrived, the house rose out of the darkness like a mountain. It was huge, bigger than any building she'd ever seen. 2 stories of dark timber and rough stone, with a wide porch that looked like a snarling mouth. A few lonely, golden lights glowed in the windows. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress built to keep the world out. The front door opened before they even reached it. A woman stood silhouetted in the light. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight, severe bun, but her face, as she came into the lantern light, was surprisingly kind. This was Mrs. Gable, Arthur's housekeeper, a woman who was as much a part of the ranch as the ancient trees that lined the creek. Her eyes widened just a fraction when she saw Hannah, a tiny, drenched figure in the wagon. But she showed no other surprise. She'd learned long ago that her employer was a man of few words and sudden, strange decisions. "Get her inside," Arthur grunted. He lifted Hannah down from the wagon as if she weighed no more than a feather. "She needs to be fed and put to bed." He spoke about her, not to her, like she was a stray calf he'd found wandering on the range. Mrs. Gable just nodded, her gaze softening as she took in Hannah's pale, rain-streaked face. "Of course, Mr. Vance." She took Hannah's small, cold hand in her own. Her hand was warm and dry and steady. "Come along, dear. Let's get you out of those wet things and find you some supper." Hannah let the woman lead her into the house. The inside was just like the outside, vast, dark, and overwhelmingly silent. Polished wood floors gleamed in the dim light. Heavy leather furniture stood like sleeping beasts. The heads of deer and elk stared down from the walls with glassy, dead eyes. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, but the fire inside was just a few dying embers casting more shadows than warmth. The air smelled of wood smoke and old leather and something else. Sadness. It was the quietest house she had ever been in. It was a house that had forgotten how to breathe, a house holding its breath for 10 long years. Mrs. Gable took her to the kitchen, the one room that felt warm and alive. She gave Hannah a simple supper of bread and warm milk. Arthur ate his own meal in the cavernous dining room, alone at the head of a long, empty table that could have seated 20. Afterward, Mrs. Gable led Hannah up a wide, creaking staircase to a room at the very end of the hall. The room was clean and spare. A simple bed, a dresser, a small window that looked out into the stormy blackness. But in the corner, draped in a white dust cloth, was a shape that made Hannah's breath catch in her throat. A wooden crib. Arthur had followed them to the doorway. He stopped dead when he saw it. For just a second, a mask of raw, unguarded pain twisted his face. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by his usual cold emptiness. He hadn't been in this room in 10 years, not since the day it all went wrong. He turned without a word and retreated down the hall. His footsteps were heavy, each one an echo of a loss he could never outrun. "You sleep now," Mrs. Gable said gently. She tucked a thick, heavy quilt around Hannah's small body. "You're safe here tonight." Hannah lay in the strange big bed, listening to the storm rage. The house groaned around her like a living thing in pain. She wasn't with her cruel stepmother anymore, but she wasn't home. She didn't have a home. She pulled the little wooden bird from her pocket and clutched it tight under the covers. Its smooth, familiar shape was the only thing in the world that felt real. She closed her eyes, and exhaustion finally pulled her under. But sleep didn't bring peace. Later that night, a sound cut through the oppressive silence of the house. A child's cry, thin and terrified. Arthur sat bolt upright in his bed. The sound was so alien, so out of place in his silent world, that he thought he was dreaming. Then it came again. A choked sob from the end of the hall. The girl. He swung his legs out of bed, pulled on his trousers, and moved down the hallway, a ghost in his own home. The sobbing guided him through the darkness. He pushed her door open. In the faint moonlight that broke through the storm clouds, he could see her. She was thrashing in the big bed, tangled in the quilts, trapped in a nightmare. "No," she whimpered. "Please, don't leave me." He stood in the doorway, a large, useless silhouette. He didn't know what to do. The part of him that knew how to offer comfort had been carved out and buried with Eleanor. He should wake her. He knew he should, but he couldn't bring himself to touch her. Instead, he did the only thing he could think of. He walked over to the straight-backed chair by the window and sat down. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there, his presence a silent, solid weight in the room. And a strange thing happened. Slowly, as if she could feel that she wasn't alone anymore, Hannah's frantic movements began to subside. Her whimpers softened. Her breathing evened out, deepening into the steady, peaceful rhythm of sleep. She had curled onto her side, her small fist resting on the pillow near her face. And from her clenched fingers, the wing of a small carved bird peeked out. Arthur stared at it. It was just a little wooden toy, crudely carved, but something about it, something about the specific grain of the wood, tickled a memory in the back of his mind, a memory he couldn't quite grasp. He remained in the chair for a long time, long after the storm outside had passed. He just sat there, watching the child sleep, and in the quiet of that room, the thick, high walls he had built around his heart began to feel dangerously thin. He had filled his life with land and cattle, solid, predictable things that couldn't be stolen from him by a cruel twist of fate. But this child, this unwanted scrap of humanity, had slipped through his defenses without even trying, and he felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a decade, something fierce, unwelcome, and terrifying. He felt protective, and he had no idea what to do about it. The morning after the storm, the world was washed clean. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and the entire ranch glistened with leftover rain. Hannah woke up feeling small and lost in the big bed. She dressed quickly in her old worn clothes and crept downstairs, following the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, humming softly as she worked at the big iron stove. "Good morning," the housekeeper said, offering a small, genuine smile. "Did you sleep well after the storm passed?" Hannah just nodded, her hand in her pocket, clutching the wooden bird. She felt a desperate, clawing need to be useful, to earn her place, to not be a burden that could be easily cast aside again. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice a mouse squeak. Mrs. Gable looked surprised for a moment, then her smile widened. "Well, I suppose you could set the cutlery on the table for us, just 2 places, in here." Arthur found them like that when he came in from his morning chores. Mrs. Gable at the stove, and the little girl, Hannah, carefully and with intense concentration, placing a fork and a knife beside 2 plates at the small kitchen table. Not the big, dead dining room table. The kitchen table. He stopped in the doorway, unseen. He watched the way her brow furrowed as she made sure the forks were perfectly straight. She wasn't asking for anything. She was just trying to belong. For the first time in 10 years, he wouldn't be eating his breakfast alone. And the thought didn't feel like a violation. It felt different. A few hours later, Sheriff Callahan rode up, just as promised. Arthur met him on the porch. "Mornin', Arthur," the sheriff said, looking uncomfortable. "Sent a wire down the line. Found your stepmother, Martha Thorne. She's in Green River." Arthur's gut tightened. "What did she say?" "Claimed the girl's a handful. Said she ran off at the station." The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Said she'll come collect her as soon as she can arrange passage back." The news landed like a stone in Arthur's chest. sending her back to that woman. Roads are washed out from the storm, Arthur said, the lie coming easily to his lips. It'll be a few days before they're passable for a buggy. Tell her to wait. The sheriff nodded. It was a plausible lie. Will do. But Arthur... He paused, looking at the rancher with a strange expression. She said something else, something odd. What's that? She said to tell you that she knows what you owe the girl's father, and she's coming to collect on that too. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Arthur standing on the porch, the world tilting under his feet. What you owe the girl's father. The words echoed in his head. He didn't know the girl's father. He'd never met the man. It had to be a trick, some kind of grift. But the sheriff's words had felt heavy with unspoken meaning. He spent the rest of the day in a fog. He watched Hannah as she followed Mrs. Gable around the garden, her small hands struggling to pull weeds. He watched her sit on the porch railing for an hour, just watching the horses in the corral, her face solemn and still. Later that afternoon, he found her by the creek, talking in soft whispers to the little wooden bird. He approached quietly. "Can I see it?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Hannah looked up, startled. She hesitated, then held it out to him. Arthur took the small bird in his big, calloused hand. He turned it over and over. It was carved from pine, that much was clear. But there was something about it, a faint reddish streak in the grain. He'd seen wood like this before, a long time ago. He ran his thumb over the base of the bird, and his heart stopped. There, nearly worn away, so faint he'd almost missed it, was a carved initial, a single letter T. And suddenly, the memory that had been tickling the edge of his mind came crashing down on him. The reddish pine, the initial, the quiet man who used to work for him, a man who was always whittling in his spare time, a man who had been with him on the worst day of his life, a man named Thomas, Hannah's father. And Arthur Vance suddenly felt the cold, sick dread of a man realizing he's been living in a ghost story he didn't even know was being written. He wasn't just connected to this girl by chance. He was connected to her by the tragedy that had defined his entire life. Martha wasn't just coming for the girl. She was coming for him. The pieces started clicking into place with horrifying speed. Thomas, a quiet, dependable ranch hand. He'd only worked for Arthur for a single season, the season it had all happened. The season Eleanor died. Arthur remembered him now, a widower himself, with a young daughter he kept in town. A man who was good with his hands, always carving little animals from scraps of wood. He'd given one to Arthur's wife once, a small wooden horse. She had loved it. And Thomas had been there. That day, the day the bridge collapsed. The official story was simple. A spring flood had weakened the supports of the small wooden bridge over the ravine at the edge of his property. Arthur, his pregnant wife Eleanor, and their 2-year-old son had been crossing in the wagon. The bridge had given way. The wagon had plunged into the churning water below. Arthur had been thrown clear. He had survived. They had not. A tragic accident, an act of God. But that wasn't the whole story. And nobody knew that except for Arthur. And apparently Thomas. Thomas had been riding just ahead of them. He'd made it across the bridge moments before it groaned and splintered. He had seen it all. He had seen Arthur whipping the horses, trying to make it across before the storm hit, even though Eleanor had begged him to wait. He had seen the panicked look on Arthur's face. The recklessness. The pride. After the accident, Arthur had paid Thomas a generous severance. He'd told the man to leave, to take his daughter and start a new life somewhere else. It wasn't blackmail. It was guilt money, blood money, a desperate attempt to bury the last witness to his failure. He had assumed Thomas had disappeared forever, but he hadn't. He had stayed nearby, and he had died, and he had talked. He had told his new wife Martha everything. She knows what you owe the girl's father. It wasn't a grift. It was a threat. Arthur looked out the window. Hannah was on the porch, carefully mending a tear in her worn dress with a needle and thread Mrs. Gable had given her. Her small face was a mask of concentration. She was resilient. She was a survivor, just like her father had been. The silence in his house was changing. It wasn't just the absence of his family anymore. Now, it was filled with the ghost of his guilt. He had lived in a gray, colorless world for so long, and this child, this living, breathing reminder of his greatest shame, was slowly bringing the color back. But it wasn't the color of hope. It was the color of blood. He was beginning to see her not as a problem to be solved, but as a debt to be paid. A week passed, a week of stolen time. Arthur said nothing to Mrs. Gable, nothing to Hannah. He just watched the road. Every dust cloud on the horizon made his stomach clench. He found himself teaching Hannah the names of the constellations at night, showing her how to properly saddle a horse, reading to her by the fire in the evenings. It was as if he was trying to cram a lifetime of fatherhood into a few short days. He found himself listening for her footsteps on the stairs. He found himself looking for her small figure on the porch when he rode in from the fields. He was becoming attached, and that terrified him more than anything else. Attachment was a liability. It was a weakness he couldn't afford. Then one afternoon, the dust cloud he'd been dreading appeared on the horizon. A dusty buggy rattling up the long drive to the ranch house. In the driver's seat was Sheriff Callahan, and beside him sat a woman in a severe gray dress, her face a mask of grim self-righteousness. It was Martha. Hannah was on the porch, trying to coax a stray kitten with a saucer of milk. When she saw the buggy, she froze. All the color drained from her face. The saucer slipped from her fingers and shattered on the wooden planks, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. In an instant, she was on her feet and running. Not away from the house, but toward the barn. Toward the one person in this world she had instinctively come to see as a shield. She crashed into Arthur's legs, her small hands gripping the rough denim of his trousers. She was trembling like a leaf in a high wind, but she made no sound. She just hid behind him, pressing her face against his leg. Arthur placed a large, heavy hand on her head. It was the first time he had willingly touched her with such tenderness. The gesture was pure instinct, a wall rising to meet a threat. He stood his ground as the sheriff and Martha climbed down from the buggy. "Arthur," the sheriff began, his expression deeply uncomfortable. "Mistress Thorne is here to collect her stepdaughter." Martha stepped forward, her lips a thin, hard line. She tried to arrange her face into a look of motherly concern, but her eyes were cold and sharp. They weren't looking at Hannah. They were sweeping over the grand house, the huge barn, the vast rolling lands that stretched to the horizon. She was taking inventory. "Hannah, you naughty girl," she said, her voice cloyingly sweet, like honey laced with poison. "Running off and worrying me so. You've caused this good man a world of trouble." Arthur felt the child behind him flinch, burrowing deeper against his leg. He kept his hand firmly on her head, a silent anchor in a turbulent sea. He looked directly at Martha, his pale gray eyes as cold and hard as chips of ice. "She didn't run off," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. "She was left at a train station with a single coin." Martha's righteous facade flickered for a second, a flash of anger in her eyes. "That's a lie. The girl is a storyteller, always has been, full of fantasies." "Is she?" Arthur's voice was deceptively calm. He knew this woman's kind. She wasn't here for the child. She was here for what the child represented: leverage. He decided to play her game, to see her cards. "You know, Mistress Thorne," he said, his tone smooth as silk, "raising a child is a great expense, a burden, some might say, especially for a woman on her own." A flicker of avarice, quick and ugly, flashed in Martha's eyes before she could hide it. "It is my duty. Her father would have wanted it. "I'm sure," Arthur said, his voice now laced with an icy edge she couldn't miss. "But I'm a man who believes in easing burdens." This was the moment. The negotiation. He reached into his coat pocket. Martha's eyes followed the movement, expecting a wallet, a pouch of coins, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a leather pouch, yes, but also a folded legal document. He had ridden to a neighboring town 2 days prior. He had seen a lawyer. He had prepared for this war. "I am prepared to offer you a sum," he said, his voice flat and businesslike, "to compensate you for your past troubles, and to relieve you of your future duties. A clean break." The sheriff shifted his weight, his eyes wide. This was not how he had expected this to go. Martha stared at the pouch, then at the document. Her greed was at war with her performance of a grieving widow. This is highly irregular," she stammered, though her eyes remained glued to the money pouch. "These are irregular circumstances," Arthur countered smoothly. He took a step forward and tossed the heavy pouch onto a nearby hay bale. It landed with a satisfying thud and the heavy clink of gold coin. "That is $500. A fortune. More money than Martha had ever seen in her life. Enough for a new start. Far away from here. And this," he said, holding up the paper, "is a document, witnessed by the sheriff, relinquishing all claim to the child." Martha's eyes darted from the money to Arthur's face. She was searching for a weakness, a trick. But she found none. Only cold, hard resolve. But then a sly, triumphant smile spread across her face. He had underestimated her. She wasn't here for a simple payoff. She was here for the whole damn mine. $500? She scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can buy my silence for $500? My husband, Thomas, he told me everything before he died. He told me about the bridge, about your wife, about your son." The sheriff's head snapped up. His eyes bored into Arthur. The air crackled with sudden tension. "He told me how you were drunk," Martha hissed, her voice rising, each word a poisoned dart. "How you raced the storm because you were too proud to wait. How your recklessness killed your own family. Thomas saw it all. He was your witness." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. Hannah, still hidden behind his legs, had gone completely rigid. "My Thomas was a good man," Martha continued, her voice now a venomous whisper. "He kept your secret. He let you live your life on this grand ranch built on your wife's money, while he died poor. You don't owe me $500, Mr. Vance." She took a step closer, her eyes glittering with a terrible, triumphant fire. "You owe me half of everything." The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The birds went silent. There was only the sound of Martha's venomous words hanging in the air, thick and poisonous. The sheriff looked at Arthur, his face a mixture of shock and dawning suspicion. He was no longer a neutral party. He was a lawman who had just heard an accusation of criminal negligence. Manslaughter. Arthur was trapped, cornered. He had built a fortress of lies for 10 years, and this woman had just blown a hole right through the main gate. If he fought her, she would spread her story through the entire territory. Drunk, reckless. The man who killed his own wife and child. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The mud would stick. His name, his reputation, would be ruined. He would be an outcast. And Hannah, what would happen to Hannah? The court would never let him keep her. She would be sent back to this monster. Martha knew she had him. The smirk on her face was ugly, triumphant. She had played her hand perfectly. She wasn't just here to collect a debt. She was here to stage a hostile takeover. "What'll it be, Mr. Vance?" she purred. "A quiet partnership, or a very public scandal?" Arthur's mind raced. He had no defense. Thomas was dead. It was his word against hers. And her story, however twisted, had the ring of truth to it. The town already thought he was a cold, hard man. It wasn't a great leap to imagine him as a careless one. His life was over. The quiet solitude he had cherished was about to be shattered forever. He would either live as a pariah or as a prisoner to this vile woman's greed. He looked down at the top of Hannah's head, her small body still pressed against him. He had failed his first family. He was about to fail her, too. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over him. And then a small voice spoke. "That's not what happened." The voice was tiny, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned. Hannah stepped out from behind Arthur's leg. She was no longer trembling. Her small face was pale, but her moss-green eyes were clear and steady. She was looking right at Martha. "That's not how my papa told it," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. Martha let out a short, ugly laugh. "What would a child know? You're just repeating stories he told you in your fantasies." "He didn't tell me a story," Hannah said, taking another step forward. She was standing beside Arthur now, not behind him, a tiny soldier standing shoulder to shoulder with her general. "He told me the truth. He told me on his last night. He said he needed me to remember." She turned her gaze to the sheriff. "My papa said Mr. Vance wasn't drunk. He said Mrs. Vance was having the baby. Early. He said Mr. Vance was trying to get her to the doctor before the storm hit. He was trying to save her." Arthur stared down at the little girl, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never told anyone that detail. Not a soul. He had been too ashamed, too consumed by his own guilt. "And the bridge," Hannah continued, her voice unwavering. "Papa said a big branch had fallen. It was blocking the road. He got off his horse to move it. That's when he saw the bridge supports. He said they were cracked. He shouted. He tried to warn them." She looked back at Martha, her eyes flashing with a righteous fire that Arthur had never seen before. "And he said you're not my stepmother. You were just his nurse when he was sick. He was never married to you. He told me you went through his papers after he died. You found the letters about the money Mr. Vance sent. You found me. You lied." The final accusation hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity. Martha's face went white, then a blotchy, furious red. The mask was gone. All that was left was raw, cornered hatred. "She's lying! The child is a born liar!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. But it was too late. The sheriff was looking at Martha now, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The story from the child, with its specific, private details, had the undeniable weight of truth. Martha's story was just a vague accusation of drunkenness. Hannah's was a detailed, heroic account. "And one more thing," Hannah said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird. She held it out. "My papa carved this. He said he carved it from the branch that fell on the road that day, the one he was moving when the bridge broke." She looked up at Arthur, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "He said he wanted me to have it, so I would always remember what a brave man looked like." Arthur took the bird from her small hand. He looked at the reddish grain of the pine, at the worn initial T, and he finally understood. Thomas hadn't been a witness to his shame. He had been a witness to his desperation, his love for his wife, his frantic attempt to save his family. Thomas hadn't taken his money as a bribe to stay silent. He had taken it as a gift from a grieving man, a man he had tried to help. The weight of 10 years of guilt, a weight he had carried every single day, finally, miraculously, began to lift. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had lost everything. He looked at Martha. Her face was a twisted mask of fury and defeat. She had been exposed. Her entire scheme had been dismantled by the simple, honest memory of an 8-year-old girl. "Sheriff," Arthur said, his voice clear and steady for the first time in a decade, "I believe Mistress Thorne is guilty of fraud, and of attempting to extort money. I'd like to press charges." The sheriff nodded, his face grim. He took a step toward Martha. "Ma'am, I think you'd better come with me." Martha sputtered, trying to protest, but the fight was gone out of her. She was beaten. She shot one last look of pure hatred at Hannah, then allowed the sheriff to lead her back to the buggy. They stood there, Arthur and Hannah, side by side, and watched as the buggy turned and rattled back down the long road, taking the last of the poison with it. The dust settled. The threat was gone. The silence that returned was not the heavy, oppressive silence of before. It was a clean, peaceful quiet. Arthur looked down. Hannah was still standing rigidly beside him. He knelt, an awkward, unaccustomed movement for him, bringing himself down to her level. For the first time, he looked her fully in the face, not as a problem, not as a burden, not as a reminder of his past, but as his savior, as his. "She's gone," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "She won't be back." Hannah looked up at him, her moss-green eyes wide and searching. She saw the hard lines of his face, the deep-set grief that still shadowed his eyes. But she also saw something new taking root there, a resolve, a purpose, a promise. "You're home, Hannah," he said, the words feeling both strange and profoundly right on his tongue. He rested his hand on her shoulder, the gesture now feeling natural, necessary. "This is your home now." For the first time since her father had died, Hannah felt the tight, cold knot of fear inside her begin to dissolve. A single hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she leaned forward and, with a tentative shyness, wrapped her small arms around his neck. Arthur froze for a heartbeat, his body stiff with surprise and a decade of unspent emotion. Then slowly, his own arms came up and enclosed her in a protective, grounding embrace. On the vast, lonely expanse of his ranch, under the wide and watchful sky, a family was born, not of blood, but of circumstance, of resilience, and of the unexpected, unbelievable grace of a broken man finding a reason to heal. The seasons turned on the Vance expanse. Summer bled into a golden autumn, and autumn gave way to the crisp, clean silence of winter. But the silence was different now. The ranch house, once a hollow monument to sorrow, began to fill with new sounds. The soft thud of small boots on the stairs, the murmur of a child's voice reading aloud by the fire, and on rare, startling occasions, the bright, clear sound of laughter. Arthur found his entire world reordered around this small, quiet girl. He bought her new clothes, dresses of soft flannel and sturdy denim that weren't gray and worn. He cleared the dust and the ghosts from the nursery at the end of the hall. With Mrs. Gable's help, he transformed it into Hannah's room, with a proper bed, a small desk, and a shelf for the books he found himself buying for her every time he went to town. The old, unused crib was dismantled and stored away in the farthest corner of the barn, a final, quiet closing of a painful chapter. He taught her to ride, starting her on a gentle, aging mare named Daisy. He watched with a strange, fierce pride as her initial fear gave way to a quiet confidence in the saddle. They would ride out together in the mornings, checking fence lines or moving cattle to new pastures. During these long, quiet rides, she would pepper him with questions. What was the name of that wildflower? Why was the sky blue? How did a cow know which calf was hers? He answered every question with a patience he never knew he possessed. The words, once so difficult for him, now came easily. He was talking more than he had in 10 years combined. He was telling her about the land, about the animals, about the stars. He was teaching her everything he knew. In the evenings, a new ritual formed. After supper, they would sit by the fire in the great room. He would pull a book from his late wife's collection, books that hadn't been touched in a decade, and he would read to her. He read tales of adventure in far-off lands, his deep voice filling the room that had been silent for so long. Hannah would listen, her head often resting against his arm, her wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece above the fire, as if it, too, were listening to the stories. One evening, as he was reading, she reached out and traced the long, pale scar on the back of his hand, a souvenir from a long-ago encounter with barbed wire. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. Arthur looked down at his hand, then at her earnest face, illuminated by the firelight. He thought for a moment. "No," he said, the truth of his own words surprising him. "Not anymore. Scars just remind you that you healed." He realized in that moment that he was finally healing. The raw, open wound of his grief, a wound he had guarded and nursed for 10 years, was finally beginning to scar over. This child, with her quiet strength and her unspoken understanding of loss, had been the medicine he never knew he needed. She hadn't replaced what he had lost. Nothing could ever do that. But she had given him something new to live for, a reason to look forward instead of constantly, painfully, looking back. One crisp spring morning, nearly a year after she had arrived, Arthur and Hannah stood on the porch together, watching the sun rise over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of rose and gold. His ranch, his land, no longer looked empty to him. It looked full. It looked like a future. Hannah, now a healthy, bright-eyed 9-year-old, stood beside him, her hand tucked comfortably into his. She was no longer the frightened, abandoned girl from the train station. She was home. "Arthur?" she said, her voice clear in the still morning air. "Yes, Hannah." She looked up at him, her green eyes serious. "My father used to say that a home isn't the building you live in," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's the people you live with." Arthur looked down at her, at the absolute trust and boundless affection shining in her eyes. And a slow smile spread across his face, a real smile, one that eased the hard lines around his mouth and reached all the way to his own eyes, making them shine with a light that had been absent for a decade. He squeezed her hand gently. "Your father," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to fight, "was a very wise man." Together, they stood on the porch and watched the new day dawn over their shared world. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you don't expect, the ones that are pieced together from broken parts to create a whole that is stronger and more resilient than ever before. The rich rancher had discovered a wealth far greater than land or money, and the orphan girl had found that the end of one journey can be the beginning of a far, far greater one. What do you think really happened on that bridge? Was it just an accident, or was there more to the story that even Hannah didn't know? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten pages of history.